And the first thing I would suggest, very simply, God had said he was going to make them a great nation. Well, any nation needs a law. There has to be a certain organization. A lot of the laws that God gave the children of Israel were what we'd look at and think of as civil laws. I think they all had a moral basis, but a lot of them were civil laws. Others were sort of administrative types of matters for the nation and so on. And so if they're going to be this nation, this seed of Abraham, God had promised to make his seed a great nation, well, any nation needs a law. And so I think on one just very fundamental level, God had to give the children of Israel some laws that would be what would define and organize them as a nation and as a people. But I think there's much more to it than just that. The second thing that I would suggest, a second purpose that I believe was served by the law of Moses and the overall story of the Bible and plan of the Bible, is that the laws God gave the children of Israel serve to clarify and identify the sin that man needs to be saved from. Now, well, doesn't everybody know what sin is? Well, in one sense, yeah, I think ever since Adam and Eve. I think God has made us so that there are certain things that we recognize are sinful. I think that's part of what it is to be made in the image of God. But the fact of the matter is, the more sinful man becomes, the more corrupted his perception and understanding of what sin is becomes. And we're certainly well aware of how that works in our day. In our day, some of the most heinous sins are defended as, civil rights. In our day, we live in a time kind of like Prophet Hosea spoke of when people call that which is evil good and that which is good evil. Where it seems like people have gotten entirely twisted. But it's not entirely twisted. There is still a general idea. I mean, most everybody would say, well, at least usually lying is wrong. A lot of people would say it's okay to lie in some circumstances. Most people would say usually lying is wrong. Actually, what most people believe is lying is okay unless you're talking to me. Now, if you're telling me something, it's not right to lie. And we tend to have intensely personal definitions of those types of things. But the point is that, yes, there is a general knowledge of sin, but man in his sinfulness tends to forget what the real boundaries of sin are. And he needs to be taught. He needs to be reminded, these things are sinful. Paul spoke of this function of law, I believe, in Romans chapter 7, when he said, I had not known covetousness, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. That the law made it clear as to what things God really did reckon as sin, especially in a world where people were apt to take that which was sinful and call it good, and that which was good and call it wrong. So it had a second purpose. A third purpose, it seems to me, that was served by the law in the overall plan of the Bible, is they taught man something very important about living under God's law. They taught man how hard it really was to live under God's law. Hard, understand, not in the sense of it causing you pain and suffering to live under God's laws. God's laws were good, and they were intended for the good of the children of Israel. But God's standard is very high. God's standard of righteousness is nothing less than his own righteousness, his own holiness, his own perfection, far above all sin and corruption. And when God gives a law to his people, that law specifies, it's not arbitrary, it's a law that specifies how they can live righteously and godly before him, how they can be like God themselves in their conduct and in their behavior. When God says, thou shalt not lie, it wasn't like he flipped a coin up in heaven, will I have him lie or will I have him not? I think I'll, make the law not. I mean, the very nature of God was such that he could not enjoin any law upon his people, but that they not lie, that they be like him, because he is truth and he cannot lie. Now, the point in saying all of that is that once God reveals himself in his real standard of righteousness as the law that we are to live by, we are made acutely aware of our own sinfulness. And so the point is that the law not only clarifies what sin is, the point I was making a moment ago, but it helps us to see our own sinfulness and how hard it is to live apart from sin. And Paul would speak of the law shutting up all under sin. That everyone who is under the works of the law is under a curse, he says in Galatians chapter 3. For it is written, cursed is everyone who continues not in all the works of the law to do them. And the point is that we suddenly realize how far we fall short of God's standard of holiness and righteousness. And thus, in a sense, the law helped to teach man that he wasn't going to be able to save himself just by his own righteousness. That even when God does give a law and say, okay, this is what you have to do to be righteous, that doesn't prove to be the means by which man says, oh, well, I do all those things, I'm righteous, I don't need to worry. No, that's not what happens. What happens is man suddenly realizes, I have already fallen so far short of that, I'm in desperate need of help. And so in that sense, the law served to drive us towards Christ and make us realize that we needed not only a law of what God's righteousness was, we needed forgiveness for our sins when we fall short of that righteousness. The law helped us see our need for forgiveness of sin. And so that really is my third point. The law served to show the difficulty of living without sin and the need for grace, the need for forgiveness. But now I want to come to another point, and really what I think are the most important functions of the law are these last two. I believe that the law of Moses provided what we might say is a temporary basis, a provisional basis for forgiveness of sin and reconciliation between God and man. God had made the promise to Abraham about 2,000 years before Christ, before the real solution would come. And the making of this covenant for the descendants of Abraham occurs about 1,500 years before. At the time they entered into this covenant here, at the time God took them out of Egypt and made them His nation and His people, they were still 1,500 years from the coming of Christ and the real solution to the problem of sin. And, a lot of times we can just, in earthly things, we can see a real solution down the road somewhere, but we need a temporary solution in the meantime. And I believe that was one of the main functions that the law of Moses served. It was a temporary solution to the problem of sin. What is the problem? Man needs forgiveness of his sin. He doesn't just need to know what the law is, he needs forgiveness where he's violated the sin, and he needs to be brought back into fellowship with God. The tabernacle, and later the temple that replaced that, was sort of the very center of the religious life of the nation of Israel. It was there in that tabernacle that the copy of the covenant was kept. It was before that tabernacle that the altar of sacrifice was made. And it was in that tabernacle that God Himself dwelt in the midst of the children of Israel. And He dwelt there on the basis of the fact that it was there that they offered their sacrifices for sin. Now those sacrifices, the animals, the blood of bulls and goats that were sacrificed there, that wasn't a perfect and complete solution to the problem of sin. As we are reminded, Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 4, it's not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. But it was something that God accepted on a provisional basis. And so there was that sort of temporary solution, not the permanent solution, but a temporary solution in the animal sacrifices for the problem of sin. And as to restoration of fellowship between God and man, them being brought back together, well, God condescended to come and dwell in the tabernacle. Now, it wasn't a full restoration of fellowship. The average Israelite couldn't even go into the tabernacle. It was definitely kind of I'm with you, but keep your hands off. I'm going to be present among you, but it's still at a distance. And yet, it was a beginning. It was a beginning of the solution to the problem of sin. But more than that, I'm going to suggest that the Old Covenant was a temporary solution to the problem of sin. But here's my follow-up and my fifth point on that, and really I guess you'd say sort of the concluding point of this. The law was not only a temporary solution to the problem of sin, it was a temporary solution that it wasn't just kind of hatched up out of nowhere for who knows what reasons. It was a temporary solution that was designed to foreshadow what the real solution was going to be like. In other words, it was, I use the term a lot of times, it was a prototype. Now, the term prototype doesn't show up in the Bible, although the term type shows up in the Bible. It was a type or a shadow of that which was to come. Well, we don't use either of those words in exactly that sense, but we do use the word prototype. We know what a prototype is. It's something that looks like what the real thing is going to be. It serves in the place of the real thing until you can get the real thing. That's what the automakers do, in Detroit, wherever they are all scattered now. When they're planning a car, they make a prototype. And you know what about prototypes? They don't really run. They don't really work. The first ones don't. They're just made out of wood and clay. But they look like, and they point to the one that's really going to work. Well, the law of Moses was in many ways like that. It was a temporary solution that was designed at the same time to foreshadow what the real solution would be. And so, when they brought their animal sacrifice for their sin, that animal sacrifice was provisionally accepted by God for the time being. As a matter of fact, God even said, you do this and your sins will be forgiven, Leviticus chapter 4. But, more importantly, that animal sacrifice pointed to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ himself as the sacrifice for sin. And they had their priests that served at the altar. And those priests, as mediators between God and the nation of Israel, those priests pointed to the coming of Christ as the mediator between all men and God, based on the sacrifice that he himself would offer, namely his own flesh and his own blood. And so I would suggest that those two ideas really help us to see what the importance of the law of Moses was in the overall scheme of redemption. It was a temporary solution, temporary fulfillment, you might say, of the promise to Abraham, a temporary solution to the problem of sin. But it was designed at the same time to point towards, to foreshadow, to serve as a prototype of what the real solution to the problem of sin was going to be. And that's why Paul says what he does in Galatians chapter 3, when he talks about the law was added because of transgression. And it's kind of like a parenthesis there. In other words, it's there for the time being, but it's not the real fulfillment. It's just a partial fulfillment, sort of an exemplary fulfillment of the law of Moses. But the real fulfillment will be with the coming of Christ and his covenant. Well, I'm going to stop here this evening.